I lay there for a few seconds, fixed my bayonet, and in a minute was up the hill. What happened after, I shall never forget as long as I live. I was just putting my hand into my haversack to feel for a bomb when a shell burst just a little to the right of me, and at the same minute it felt as if someone had hit me in the back with a sledgehammer.
Today's guest was an avid student of military history from a young age, and when he started looking into his ancestry, found 11 ancestors that fought in World War I. And lucky for us, they were prolific letter writers, providing an insight into what life was like on the front lines. Utilising his 16 years in the police force, today's guest became a battlefield investigator and tracked his ancestors, affectionately referred to as the boys, through Egypt, Gallipoli and the Western Front. We are lucky enough to hear some of the letters in today's episode, and you can find more in his book, Duty Nobly Done. Episode 108, Adam Holloway. The One Moment Please podcast.
Yeah.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I'm actually excited about having a conversation with you because you have very extensively researched World War I, because you've had ancestors that fought in World War I that were prolific letter writers, very luckily. So we have a good insight in regards to what they were going through. But how did your interest in the Great War sort of all come about?
Hi Fiona, thanks so much for having me on. World War I for me was pretty early on in the piece. I had a very big interest in military history from quite a young age. My father is a Vietnam veteran, so sort of introduced into the idea of war from a young age. And after watching a couple of movies and documentaries, I started to get interested in it. And then by the time we get to grade 8, grade 9, we're watching Gallipoli, and then it starts to take its form. And then I just started reading more and more about it. And I guess I just started to get to know all these different villages and towns in France and Belgium. And one day I thought I'd love to go there. I'd love to go and see all these things. And in 99, I got to go over to France for the first time. And of course, the internet was in its infancy, so I had no idea about any of my family members who'd fought apart from my great-grandfather. And so I just sort of blundered around for a few days around the Somme and Ypres and had a good look around. And then it wasn't till maybe 5 or so years later that Dad was doing the family tree. That's what happens when you retire. You start doing Ancestry.com. So he started doing the family tree, and we discovered that my great-grandfather wasn't the only one. It was he, his 2 brothers, and 8 cousins, all from the one family. So that certainly piqued my interest, and all the reading about the First World War and suddenly had a purpose. And that started what I thought might be just a slim volume, a nice little research project. So I would, gather all the information about what the 11 boys had been doing, put it together in a small, PDF, and then send it around to the family so they knew what had happened. And I had a literal light bulb moment. And I thought, hang on, I wonder if there's a story in this. And that started some really intense research and more traveling to the Western Front. So, yeah, so pretty much from a young age all the way through to now, it's always been a real passion of mine to learn more about it.
When you were traveling around, did you find out, so you traveled around because you knew that there was a family history there, but you didn't realize how strong, and you found that out after your first trip?
That's correct. Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
I was sort of going to all different places, not fully understanding how the battles or the towns fit into everything and where my family might have been. And there were so many times I was so close to where they'd been. And when I went back in 2012, I went back with so much more information. I was literally able to walk in their footsteps and get a real feel. Yeah, to be able to write, you need to walk that ground, so you get a real feel and a real sense for the topography and the undulations of the ground and just what they could see. That's part of trying to immerse the reader into what the boys went through, was putting yourself there.
And And when you're saying write, you're talking about your book because you wrote a book about World War One.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah. So I essentially started writing about 2012, and by 2018, I'd managed to accumulate 253,000 words for the first manuscript, and Big Sky Publishing was happy enough to take it on board, which was lovely. And I had a great editor, Kathy. She was awesome, and together we went through and just whittled it down so it was nice and streamlined and telling the story pretty much from the first shots at Gallipoli all the way through to the last
Wow.
battles. So, yeah, the boys were just into basically every battle except one. So it was a really great opportunity to learn even more about the First World War. That was for me such a huge learning opportunity. So yeah, and eventually Nobly Done was written and actually got to launch it on Remembrance Day, 2018. So exactly 100 years after the
Wow.
armistice. So that was a very, very special moment.
When you went back the subsequent times, did you actually have their letters? Because you said you literally walked in their footsteps. So did you have those letters and were reading them at the time when you
In
were walking that ground?
2012, yeah, no, in 2012, all I had was where their battalions had been. I hadn't quite discovered the letters yet that early in the piece. Um, what happened was when I came back and began my research in earnest, I discovered Trove, which is the National Library of Australia, where they've scanned in newspapers from 150 years ago. And so there was newspapers from the Great War between 1914 and 1919, and I
Wow.
was able to start immersing myself in that period, reading the letters. That's where I found the first letters, because what they would do is the soldiers would write home to the family, and then the local newspapers looking for stories would say, send us some of the transcriptions from the letters so we can reprint them in the paper. And so that's how I came across my first lot of letters, particularly with Frank being the first one to go. I had very little on Frank and what he did in Gallipoli, and it wasn't until I found the Trove letters that I started to really bring him to life and find out exactly what he'd done, and just his general mental approach to what was going on around him. It was quite fascinating to read it and quite
That's
special.
interesting because when I heard that you had the letters, I had envisaged you finding um, a shoebox in an attic somewhere, or in a cupboard
Mm,
that was
yeah.
at your grandparents' home or your parents' home, and you found these really old, flaky, fragile letters, but they were actually in the archives.
Yeah, in the first instance, absolutely. And I had visions of that as well. I scoured all the local relatives. I went to there and said, now, where's all your shoe boxes? Let's check under the bed. Let's check cupboards and find it. And but ultimately, the letters came from a couple of different family members and from some of the boys. I call them the boys, the 11 boys. So there's four sets of brothers, and there's a couple of twins in there as well. So, and they all come from the one set of grandparents. So it's the Holloway bloodline all the way down, which was really intriguing because there would have only been about 4 or 5 more eligible blokes to go out of such a small family. So, but I managed to get my hands on some letters probably about halfway through when I was writing the book, and luckily they were letters of some of the boys that came in halfway through the war, so it wasn't pivotal. And then later on, just through my basic researching, I came across some letters that had been sent to a fellow in Papua New Guinea in the 1960s from one of the boys. I won't say who because it'll
Wow.
spoil the book. And what was fascinating was they were both World War One veterans, and in the letter he's writing about current events in 1961, 1962, and then all of a sudden in the letter he goes back in time and just starts talking about instances from the war, and he'll say, "Oh, forgive me for harking back to the old days, but do you remember this?" And it was like 3 pages of just this clarity of remembering something that happened 50 years earlier. And part of those letters filled in a lot of blanks that I had questions about. So to come across those letters was just unbelievable. So
And how did you
um,
come across them?
online. It was just doing basic searches, and it came up on
Really?
just a lost database somewhere, and all of a sudden it came up, and we sent away for it, and it was like a family trust or something, and they sent us the letters. So yeah, it was very special to have
Wow.
that. Yeah.
And
So yeah.
had he served with this other person in PNG, or was it just someone that he knew was a veteran and therefore was sort of sharing war stories?
Yeah, he'd met him in Papua New Guinea between the wars, and this other fellow's name was Fred Palmer Archer, and he became a coast watcher during World War II, and spying on the Japanese in Rabaul. So he was eventually got back to Australia safely, because if the Japanese caught a coast watcher, it was not a
So
nice.
dangerous.
Oh,
So
forget about it.
dangerous. And
So
they were very, for those of you that don't know, they were often on atolls by themselves. They
yeah,
were on really remote areas of the coast of Australia, like Western Australia and Northern Territory and stuff.
mm,
And they were by themselves. They were isolated. So if they got captured or caught,
mm.
then there was no help coming.
No, well, especially with Fred, he was in Rabaul, just off Papua New Guinea, so he was in occupied Japanese territory at the time.
Oh wow. Oh my goodness.
So yeah, he was going to be in
Terrifying.
all sorts. Oh, it would have been, and then one of my fellow caught up with him again after, when he went back to Papua New Guinea himself, and they kept up a friendship and letter writing until the mid '60s, when Fred passed away. So it was a really fantastic insight into just how this particular one of my boys was processing the war, and how not every digger wants to talk about it, but he had no problem talking about it. So yeah, it was just part of his therapy, I guess.
It's interesting because I grew up with, well, my grandfather never talked about the war. There was one instance, I remember one afternoon, he talked about it. I don't know why, I was quite young. And I have a vivid picture of my grandfather sitting on the sofa, and I was in front of him on the floor, in front of the heater. And my mum and my aunt and my grandmother were in the kitchen, so they're behind him, so that he couldn't see them. And he was just talking to me, the
Mm,
only time he's ever talked about it. And they were all in tears behind
mm,
him, but
yeah,
not wanting to make a sound because they had never heard any of the stories either.
no,
I grew up as a generational, you just don't talk about the war, you never ask about it. So
yeah,
it's interesting that he was so forthcoming in regards to discussing the war.
yeah. And I was very blessed. I was able to talk to his grandson a couple of
Right.
times, and he remembered a few anecdotes that this fellow would be sitting at the dining table, and uh, he loved Tennyson. He'd just start reciting poetry at the dinner table. This is like in the '60s,
Yeah.
and then he'd start talking about something about the war, and then all of a sudden he'd just go quiet, and that was when they realised that he'd finished talking, and that he'd come across a memory that he didn't really want to go past, or deal with right there and then, and he would just go quiet,
Mm.
and then he'd pick up a bit later on with something else. But he was always sitting at his desk writing and writing. He kept up a correspondence with a lot of his old veteran mates, and I wish I had those letters. I'd love to know what he wrote in those letters. So it would have been fascinating to have all that, but that's all gone, unfortunately. So,
Why is it all
and
gone?
one, well, I think it's funny during the research process, and this will be the hardest part for anyone who's doing research into their family history, whether it's writing a book or something along those lines. You're going to come across people in the family who just don't want to give up the family information. So they'll have, they have letters, and they have photos, but they just don't want to give it to you for some reason. And I came across that. And then you also have instances where um, the people who were left behind didn't always look favourably on the sacrifice made by their husband, who I had an instance where one of my boys, his best mate, was killed later in the war, and his wife was left behind with 2 young daughters and a dairy farm. And when all his effects were sent home, she threw them all in a fire. So her reaction was that he'd left them and he shouldn't have gone, and she didn't want to read anything about it. So that happened a fair few times that I came across when I was researching. So, because a lot of people think about the veterans, there's a lot of people left at home that had to deal with a whole range of issues, whether the fellow was killed in action or missing or came home but never fully came home. It was a terrible, terrible conflict. So it was interesting coming across all those different aspects and effects of the war in different people as you're researching and talking to them.
What one of the boys that you refer to did you feel most connected with?
I think for me, Frank is generally everyone's favourite. I think Frank is the closest to me. I think he has a real sense of that duty and service, and he just loves his men. He gets promoted, and he just doesn't think of anything else but them and his mates. He basically, the minute the war was declared, the very next day he was enlisting. So
wow.
Yeah, he was ready to rock and roll straight away. And with his best mate Arthur Harley, they joined up together. They had consecutive regimental numbers. They went off to all their training together in Egypt, and they both ran ashore at Gallipoli together. Frank was, just from reading one of Frank's letters, you sort of, when you're writing it, you think, okay, how do I get this right without it being cliched or already done to death? And I just came across this letter where Frank basically explains from the minute he gets off the battleship Queen into the rowboats, he's actually rowing one of the boats for the last 50 yards. And he describes...
I didn't realise they were rowboats.
Yeah, so they had a little steam boat called a pinnace, and it was towing like a line of 4 or 5 big whaler rowing boats, like big lifeboats. Yeah. And they'd fit about 40 or 50 blokes in this boat, or maybe a bit less. And generally the whole platoon was in there together. And most of the soldiers are facing forward, but Frank and the other rowers are, rowing backwards, so they're not quite seeing what's happening. So then the pinnace gets to about 50 yards from shore, and they cast off, and then they have to row the last 50 yards. And then get to shore, and then he was told you have to be the last one out of the boat. And by this time, there's a few rounds coming down range, and then he manages to get out of the boat and get up onto shore, and it goes from there. So yeah, so it's basically the opening scene of the book. So,
do you have a letter there from him that you can read?
I have a couple of different letters from Frank.
Do you have one describing that scene?
Yeah. Hang on a second.
Do they still teach Gallipoli and watch the movies and stuff at school?
Yeah, absolutely they do. I had the good fortune recently to give a presentation at my son's grade 9 class. So they had me come in because they suspected I might know a little bit about the war. So I thought I'd better go in there and do that. And also
that's cool. That would have been cool for your son.
Yeah, it was great, and also to do an Anzac Day service a couple of years ago too, where I got to speak as well. So I really did enjoy that aspect of keeping the memory alive. So what I've got here is he's basically written to his parents, and it's the story of the landing retold. And he basically says, I'll run through here. He goes, I had been picked for an oarsman. I had never done any rowing before except in the landing practice at Lemnos, but I can tell you I rowed then if I ever did. The oarsman had orders to stay in the boats until last, but this was impossible. The men, in their eagerness to get over the side of the boats, crushed us against the sides. I tried to stand up, but could not for the crush. However, I let my oar slip into the water and leaned over the side, and by degrees was pushed over. I went clean under, but getting my feet on the bottom, I gave myself a push forward, landing in shallower water. I managed to struggle out of the water under the shelter of the cliffs and fell on my face, clean knocked out by the rowing. I lay there for a few seconds, fixed my bayonet, and in a minute was up the hill. What happened after, I shall never forget as long as I live. And then it just goes from there. It's unbelievable.
For those that are listening outside of Australia and aren't familiar with the Australian history of Gallipoli and what actually took place there, can you briefly summarise the horrific situation that those guys found themselves and why they were on that beach, that Gallipoli beach?
So when the Australian Imperial Force was created and they were heading across to join basically the war on the Western Front, Turkey came into the war. There was also the issue of training the Australians on the Salisbury Plain, which is in England, because at that time in the winter of 1914 was quite horrific, and even Canadians were dying from the exposure. So the Australians coming from a tropical climate would not have lasted very long if the Canadians are dying. So they were diverted to Egypt to continue their training. And the plan was then developed to, once Turkey had entered the war, that they would formulate a plan to try and knock Turkey out of the war. It was initially a naval attack in February up the Dardanelles, up the Straits, but that was a failure with several ships sunk and basically tipped their hand that we were interested in the peninsula. And my understanding is the Turks had spies all through Cairo, all through Lemnos, and they knew we were coming, basically.
Yeah.
So they essentially formulated a plan with several different landing beaches. And I think one of the important things is that people realise it wasn't just the Australians and New Zealanders landing at the Peninsula at Helles at the opening of the Straits. The British and French landed large forces down there as well.
See, I never knew that. I always just thought it was the Anzacs.
Yes, exactly. And you know, and that's natural, I guess, when you're first growing up, because all you learn about is the Australian side of things. But the poor old Tommies, they landed at a place called V Beach, and they came in on a ship that was specially designed. And when I say specially, I mean not very well designed. It had gangways running down the sides and basically funneling troops into the fire of the Turks, who were sitting up on very well fortified positions. And these poor boys, they if you've seen like Saving Private Ryan, it was an absolute bloodbath. These poor boys were getting cut to pieces.
Opening scenes of yeah.
They described the landing at V Beach that the water was just running red with blood. It was just terrible. Conversely, at Anzac, the fellows that landed in the Anzac Cove were relatively sheltered. They didn't have that same level of intense fire. And when they landed, I know there's quite a few stories about whether we were landed on the right beach, the wrong beach, and things like that.
Yes, I always thought it was the wrong beach.
Yeah, look, I think my understanding is that there was a stretch, you know, between point A and point B where they were to make their landing, and and Anzac Cove was apparently included in that area. So there might have been fortuitous, maybe, because if they'd landed any further south on what's called Brighton Beach, it's in an enfiladed position, so it might not have been as sheltered. But suffice to say that the terrain that the boys suddenly faced was quite steep, rocky, and full of prickly bushes. And so essentially they basically had to scale, you know, almost cliffs to get to the top under some fire. And blokes were getting hit. And by the time they got to the top, they realised they were all mixed up as well. So all the battalions are all confused, and all the brigades were confused. So they didn't know where they were supposed to go. And then they just struck out and headed off. And as part of some of Frank's letters, I can almost track him as well as you possibly can, because it's so confused, that he's gone from Pluggy's Plateau down through Shrapnel Valley up onto 400 Plateau across Lone Pine. And in those first few hours, the Australians got across Lone Pine, but the scrub was too thick and they were losing too many blokes, and they just couldn't form a cohesive line any further past, and had to retreat back onto the ridge, and leave Lone Pine to the Turks until August 1915. So they couldn't see. The scrub was so thick that you'd lose a bloke after about a metre. So they were ducking through all that. So there was a lot of close quarters fighting, and a lot of people just went missing. But somehow they managed to hang on.
And how long did they dig in for? Because it was only expected to they were only expected to last days at most, if that, because the opposition was so fierce. How long did they end up staying?
They were there until just before Christmas. So they ended up staying for nearly 8 months. The Australians did. The British held on a little bit longer into 1916 at Helles before they withdrew. But the landing, everyone knows about the landing. They know about Lone Pine. One thing I was really mindful of was, exploring some of the battles in the book that people didn't know about. So, and also explaining how the landing wasn't a foregone conclusion. There was all talk of withdrawing on that first night, that things hadn't gone well, and they should probably try and evacuate. And then they hung on for about 4 days before they really felt as solid as they could be. And the Turks had launched a massive counterattack that was beaten back, and that basically set the trench line for the next 3.5 months before the defensive. So, yeah, there was very close. It's like there was very close instances where the Turks, if they just managed to break through one part of the line, could have been on the beach in about 10 minutes. So
it's interesting, and for those that don't know the Gallipoli history, the fighting was so intense, and the determination of the Aussies and the efforts that they did to dig in, it actually won the respect of the Turks. And Turkey has looked after that site because it is essentially a mass grave, and every year there is essentially a pilgrimage back there for Anzac Day of Australian and New Zealanders that go. And it's on my bucket list. I haven't done it. But I think for those that aren't Aussie or New Zealanders and aren't familiar with the story, that is important to know, because to win the respect of your what is probably their mortal enemy in regards to the other side of it was a couple of meters away in reality.
It absolutely was. It really was. And look, I think it's amazing the grace that we've been shown for over 100 years. I mean, I was just saying this to someone the other day. I mean, I think the last thing that Australians would do is let the Japanese come and commemorate the bombing of Darwin, or the Papua New Guineans. Yeah, the Japanese don't get invited to Kokoda, and all these other places. So you think we deliberately landed there with the express intention of killing as many of their young men as possible and capturing their capital. And even though we destroyed the flower of their youth over that 8-month period, they lost far more men than we did. They still welcome us there. Obviously, there's a tourist element, but it goes deeper than that, as you said. There's that mutual respect. But I think that's just unbelievable grace to allow that to happen. So, especially two countries. One's like a predominantly Muslim country, and the other one's predominantly like a Judeo-Christian values type country. So not only is there that aspect of it, but the fact that why we were there. So, but I think the Australians have a general respect from most of their former enemies. across the board, the Germans particularly. So there's a grudging respect there from the Japanese and the Vietnamese, I believe, from just the Australians' ability to adapt to jungle fighting and tenacity and determination. So yeah,
I didn't realise there was a respect there from the Vietnamese. I hadn't heard. I hadn't heard that at all.
Yeah.
So when you go back, and I know that you do tours there now. What's the name of your tour company that you?
It's actually really original. It's called Duty Nobly Done Battlefield Tours. So just working off that book title.
Well, we hadn't mentioned the book title. I was leading into that as well. Go on, plug it. Plug it.
Plug it there. So it's available from all good bookstores, and look, it's really an extension of the book. Is I can't let these boys go or the stories go. You know. And
was there a particular letter or story that really stuck out to you?
There's a couple of ones. It's really little stuff that stood out to me.
Yeah.
It's
like the mundane.
Yeah, like when Frank's thoughts towards his own men. When you're writing letters from Gallipoli, there's not a stationery store that you can just go and get as much paper as you like. So, paper's pretty scarce, and he gets sent a packet of paper, and his first thought is, I've got to share it with my mates, and he just dishes out all the paper to his mates so they can write a letter to their family, and then at the bottom of the letter, when he's writing back to his family, he goes, "Could you send me some more paper, please?" So he's writing on the last piece, and it's those little selfless acts that stand out to me as what typifies what people come to know as the Anzac spirit, or that mateship, putting other people before yourself, and other instances there where the boys are decorated for bravery. One particular story that I love the most, that really stands out, because the other character that people love is Henry Holloway, Frank's cousin. And his nickname's Chick, and
what a great nickname.
Oh yeah, it's short for chicken. Like, I didn't know that the etymology of, the insult of, "Oh, you're a chicken," like being a coward, but apparently it's been around for a long time. So he used to play football. He liked to punch on a bit and have a bit of a bet, he was a classic second child syndrome sort of thing going on.
Not a nickname anyway, I would have given someone to punch on. Maybe it meant something different in those days.
Well, I guess it's Little John. He's a big fella, tiny.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
The classic Australian. Let's give him the opposite nickname. So there was an instance there where Chick was checking the line. He's walking through the trenches, making sure his men are okay. He was a sergeant at the time. And there's this heavy shelling happening, and they're about to be relieved by another battalion within half an hour. And of course, that's the Germans know there's a relief happening, so they start to shell as heavily as possible. And Chick's officer, who's only been with the battalion for like 2 weeks, and 3 other men get buried alive by the shelling. And by this time, the trenches are destroyed, and Chick is basically digging with his bare hands while he's under fire. The sniper's trying to get him, and there's artillery come flying in, and he's just got no thought whatsoever but to get these boys out. He manages to save the first 3, and then finds his officer and gets him out. So he saves. How
did they get buried alive? So what was it that they were buried under?
So the trench collapsed. So the trench is like about 6 foot deep, about 2 feet, 3 feet wide.
Yeah.
And so basically,
tons of soil on top of them, essentially.
Yeah, you just be pinned and basically waiting to die a horrible death. So he's digging them out all the while under fire, and then the officer's wounded in the head, and he gets sent to the aid station, and then eventually back to Australia. Chick also gets buried 3 times. And dug out. Now, most people, when you read the letters, they get dug out like screaming ninnies, like they're just gone to pieces. They've come as close as you can to a horrible death. But the citation that he got for the military medal for saving the 4 lives is, even though he was buried 3 times, he still had a cheerful disposition. And it just speaks to the character of this man. He's still smiling and cracking jokes, and he's been buried alive. But
Oh my goodness.
uh, and then the wonderful thing during the research for the book, I got to meet the descendants of that officer, Lieutenant Kent, and I managed to track them down. And all they knew is that he'd been wounded, and I was able to tell them the full story and show them a picture of Chick. And this is the man who saved your great grandfather's life. And
Oh, I've gone all goosebumpy.
yeah, oh, and they came to my launch and to the book launch, and that was the most special moment that I had throughout all the research. Was, you're alive because of this man here, and then on top of that, Chick was alive because other people dug him out. It was just, so to be able to find them and talk to them and share all that information, that was a really special moment. So that was enjoyable.
Were there any surprises in terms of that they fought somewhere that you weren't expecting them to fight?
Um, I think probably conversely is that by finding the proper information and letters, I was able to not make the mistake of including them in a battle they weren't in. So, when they're with their battalion and they go into the battle, I know where they are, what they're doing. So it's each battalion has their battle honours of which battles they were involved in. So I was quite, I think for me, the sheer volume of battles they were all in is what surprises me the most. But luckily, I had a letter from another fellow who said, "Oh, Chick wasn't in this battle; he behind the lines," and that's when I learned about nucleus battalions. So what they would do is, before sending the entire battalion into an attack and lose the whole battalion, they'd keep 33% of the battalion behind the line. So most of the time, the battalions are only going in at 60% strength into the attack. So things like that. Like, I thought he was in that battle, but he wasn't. And if I hadn't found that letter, I would have just assumed he was. So being able to be as accurate as humanly possible was a real paramount concern for me. So that was great to find that. So I think the thing that surprised me was how each of them dealt with the battles. Like someone like
how did they each deal with it?
Yeah, so like with someone like Frank, it was very matter of fact. It was something that had to be done, and he was fairly calm with what he had to do. Chick seemed to enjoy it, like he was born for it. And then you have Paul Hilton. He and his brother Ernie, they were like the typical. They came from West End in Brisbane, so they're city boys. All the other boys are pretty much country boys. They sang in the choir at church. Hilton was the superintendent of the Sunday school, and Ernie tried to join up on his 18th birthday, but got knocked back for having he had bad teeth. And in April 1915, they had very high standards for dental stuff. So,
wow, that went down though.
Absolutely, in only a matter of months. So by August, he was joining, and so they off together. And it was just interesting looking at the way they both handled their first actions and what happened. And like particularly with Ernie, he was in the first Battle of Bulcourt in 1917. It was terrible, and just some of the things that he wrote and what others wrote, your heart just breaks, when you're writing and you're researching.
What sort of things did he write?
He wrote, and this is the other thing too, Fiona, is that the diaries are different to letters, and letters are different between who they're sending it to. So if it's a letter to a parent, it'll have, "I spoke to so-and-so the other day, I'm keeping well, thanks for the scarf, I'll try and write again in a week's time," like they're on holiday. If they're writing to a brother or another cousin in the front line, they'll come a bit closer to what's actually happened. They'll actually mention people who've been killed or things that they've done. So So a letter from Ernie to his parents is not going to give me too much information apart from he's trying to protect them, not let them worry. Whereas a letter that he writes to Chick is more about killing his first German and how that makes him feel. Because Chick was with him in training and sort of kept him under his wing a little bit because that's his cousin. And the way that Ernie sort of writes it, you can just tell as he's writing that's really bothering him a lot. So, but like most of those blokes, that feeling goes away when you're surrounded by your mates getting killed. So, yeah, it's just interesting who they share with, what they share, and how much. So, yeah. I can't comprehend what it must have been like.
Have you shared or have you had comments from modern day or even the Vietnam War veterans that have served and have read the letters? Have they commented on the information in them?
Not so much the letters, but the book itself, actually. I was very blessed to have the book selected by Army for its professional military education reading list in
Oh wow,
2021. Yeah, so that was like,
that's a big stamp of approval, isn't it?
oh, it really was. Like, it was such an
Mm,
honor. It was so humbling because I thought, it'd be great to win awards, industry book awards. And I thought,
mm.
no, to get the book selected by the very subject matter that you're writing about, the origins of the Australian Army. It's that was amazing, and I got to do a presentation at Land Warfare Centre at Canungra, and
Ah,
I got to talk to. They picked 5 officers, and the officers had to read the book and identify elements of good soldiering and pick out their favourite characters. Of course, Frank was their favourite, and they just present what they thought about the book and the instances that they could, make the correlation between modern day soldiering and that sort of thing. So it was interesting to hear their take on how they viewed a couple of things, which was how I wrote it, what I wrote about, and the accuracy and things like that. And I think one of the best compliments in answer to your question was one of the young fellows. He was an Afghanistan veteran. He'd done a couple of tours, and he came up to me quietly afterwards, and he said, "Have you ever been under fire?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "You've never served?" I said, "No." I said, "I was a police officer for a while," and he goes, "How did you write that section?" He talked about a section where there was artillery coming in and the sound and the feeling of the ground and the effect it has, the physical effect it has on the body. And he said, "I was reading that, and I honestly, I thought I was back there." And I thought that was
wow.
a lovely compliment from someone who's actually been under fire. And
Mm.
I didn't really have an answer as to how I could do that. It was just a whole, compilation of lots of information and drawing on my own physiological experiences from being under a lot of stress as a police officer that you sort of, I always think fear is fear and adrenaline is adrenaline and death is death. So you just draw on those little aspects I used to run a lot of it past my dad from being in Vietnam uh, yeah, he used to, yeah, he was very helpful in understanding a couple of things too. So yeah, it's a compilation of putting it all together. So it's
What
very
did your
stressful
dad tell
doing it
you?
though.
Well, I have two questions. So let me start with the first one.
Mhm.
Did you write the book to as a more of a memoir of your relatives in regards to historic point of view, or did you write it in terms of these are interesting characters, I can research them, yes, there's a family link, and I want to do it in terms of an Australian history stance?
I think when I first started writing it, it was just going to be for the family, and then I
Mm,
realised it could be for public consumption. So I needed to
mm,
be, very accurate with the research. But I really wanted to tell the stories of the ordinary soldiers and make sure that, you know, their mates as well were included in all of this. So we know all about the VC winners and the generals and the field marshals. But to actually get down on the ground and get into the trenches with these boys and go through it with them. And that was a real turning point for me when I decided to write it in a narrative style, in that I would put you in the action with the boys. It wouldn't just be an historical account. So
First person account.
virtually, yeah, you're on their shoulder, you're in their platoon, so you see and hear what they're going through. And that, to me, allowed me to just immerse the reader a bit more into the actual story itself. So I guess an answer is heavily researching so I get it right, so it's accurate and honors their memory. So it was always about them, not about me just writing a book. So it was always focused on them, I guess is the best way to put it. And yeah, just try to set myself a high standard for the information that went in, the information that didn't go in. So that it'll be almost, you know, it's just a testament to them, I think, is the best way to put it. Yeah, and for people to learn more about what the Australians did.
Mm. You said you ran chapters and most of the book past your dad, who was a Vietnam vet.
Mm.
Did he ever discuss Vietnam with you prior to doing the book?
Yeah, Dad's he's funny. It didn't affect him too much to hear him tell it, and it never did. Like growing up, there was never any signs that he had any issues from his tour. Um, he took lots and lots of photographs, and so we would actually have slideshows at home. And
Wow.
yeah, so he'd set up the projector, and we'd watch some slides, and he used to take the old 8mm film of us when we were little. So every now and then we look at that too. But he was a good photographer, and he took a lot of photographs of the landscape around Vietnam, but also the locals. So just taking photos of the villages and the young kids and all the different places. And he didn't go into too much detail. I recall a couple of things that he would say. He was only scared once, and that was when they was in the middle of the jungle and he couldn't even see his hand in front of his face at night time. It was that dark, and he was on guard duty. And he said that was the only time he really thought, what am I doing here? And the other time was they'd been in what they say they call it in country for 2 or 3 weeks, and he and his mate had were in a couple of jeeps, and there was 2 tanks in front of them and some APCs, and they were travelling out on an operation. And the front jeep had his best mate, and Dad was in the second jeep, and the first jeep hit a mine and brewed up. Like no one was killed, but they lost their sergeant, badly wounded, and a couple of other blokes. And Dad said that was the time where you grabbed your M16 and you just started scouting the jungle in case it was like an ambush, like an IED of sorts. And they worked out it was a mine and it wasn't an ambush. But he told me that story just really simply, many, many times. I'd always say, hey, do you remember when you told me about this? Can you tell me that story again? And he'd tell me that story. And then just the other day, this is how the mind works, that selective memory, and either whether you call it repressing a memory or he didn't want to, embellish it, or he actually just basically said, oh yeah, it tipped over and it caught fire, and then I was pulling Lenny out, then I went back and pulled out so, then I went back and pulled out so and so. I'm like, you never mentioned that before. And so it was just fascinating to sit down and have a talk to him about that, because he's been going through his memoirs at the moment. So
he's writing his own.
yeah. So it's good.
Fabulous.
Yeah, so it's very important that we document all this stuff. But just fascinating, like 40 something years I've been talking to him about it, and that's the first I've heard that part of the story. And I can only put that down to just that natural self-deprecation, not wanting to big note yourself, because he's a very humble sort of man, and yeah, it's amazing, just amazing. So
Did any of those guys survive from that
yeah,
jeep?
so they all survived, but two of them were wounded and had to go back to Australia. Dad's best mate, he had a busted eardrum, but he was back in action a week later. So they stuck together for the rest of the tour. So yeah,
Mm.
there was a bit of a shake up, but everyone just got on with what they had to do and just kept going. And
Did you
yeah,
find that was a common theme as well when you're researching the boys, that you just got on with it because that's what they had to do?
abs absolutely, absolutely, and that's where I just sort of just discover that the human mind is just the most powerful weapon. You've got a bloke who was Frank's a photographer from Roma. So he takes photos of weddings and group photos or some cattle in a field. And then they all did militia training. So they all knew how to shoot a rifle, ride a horse and things like that. But to go from being a photographer and then 5 seconds after landing at Gallipoli, they're all killers. And then that becomes the new normal. Sitting in a ditch and eating bully beef and sitting next to someone who was your best mate you were just talking to 5 minutes ago, and they're now dead in the bottom of a trench. And they can still write letters, and they can still talk about hope and reminisce about life. It's just, yeah, it gives a really amazing insight into how much the human mind can take, and then say that's the new normal, and I can operate in that. And I think it's a lot of the people around you. So if everyone's doing that, you don't want to be the guy that's not. So there'd be a lot of group support in a way, looking out for each other. Because as I said before, even after all that research, even after reading about it for so long, I still can't comprehend how they do it. So
Did all of them fight in Gallipoli?
just Frank. So Frank was the only one to
Frank.
go to Gallipoli, and then basically from July 1915 onwards, the other 10 start to enlist. And by the time they get to Egypt, Gallipoli is finished. And so basically, the next chapter is the Western Front. So they all end up in France and Belgium and progressively fight their way through to the end of the war. We lose three, so three of them are killed, and two of them have no known grave. So I've been able to go
Oh,
back
that's
over there.
sad.
It is sad. I've got a rough idea where they are, where they will be.
Okay.
Yeah, so, but to be able to go there and walk the ground away from the cemeteries, away from the memorials, and actually go out where it happened, that's really special to be able to do that. Not everyone can travel. It's expensive. It's a long way to go. But if you have the opportunity, it's hard to describe. It's a really special connection that you have with that place. So to go over there would be, yeah,
Have you
I
ever
would recommend it.
have you ever thought of going back over there and doing a virtual tour?
Um, I know there's a few podcasts that do that, and a few people who do it.
Yeah,
I'm
but
not
they're
very
not
good with
you,
social
Adam.
media.
Come
I
on.
know.
No,
I,
you just get your phone and just record yourself. And I'm doing it in video so they can
yeah,
see.
yeah.
But yeah,
I tried doing that even when I was over there last year when I was doing the reconnaissance for this year's tour in April. And I just can't do it. I just don't have the consistency or the ability to keep doing it. So it'd be a bit piecemeal and probably not very fun. Um, but what I would try and do this
you
time
need to
is try and take as many videos and photos as I can and have a running commentary going. So I'll do my best.
you
So
need to take someone that can just sort of say, "Okay, Adam, turn around and tell me where we are," and they're in control of that.
yeah, it's actually good because I've got a fellow. So essentially, how it all came about was a fellow by the name of Phil Horra. He's an Australian living in France, and he runs sacred ground tours, which is like you might go out for a day or 2 or 3 days. You might be in France and think, oh, I'm on my European holiday of a lifetime, but I want to spend a couple of days on the Western Front. So you hit up Phil, and he'll take you out and about for a couple of days, show you around the sites, and get you to know, get you around all different places. And then I thought, I sort of came on board and thought, well, let's put together some bigger tours and really get into the whole Western Front, so everyone understands how it all fits in with each other, battle, and take a group of people over and take them where their ancestors fought and sometimes died. So, and then telling the stories of those men through the tour. So trying to make a group tour personal. So but there's another fellow that I've met. He's coming along as like a bit of a dog's body. That's what he's called himself. He's going to come along as the coffee guy and the photographer. So I'll get him to take some good photos
interview
me on the ground.
on the side. Yeah.
Yeah. So inspire me to come up with something poetic or or insightful. I'm sure it'll be a real entertaining spectacle.
What was the biggest battles that the boys wrote about that they were involved in?
I think one of the biggest battles was, I think, Bulcourt with Ernie, and then I think Frank writing about a battle on Gallipoli that you never know about because there's so many different battles happening over there. You just know.
Do you have that letter? Can you read it?
Actually, absolutely. I can. I'll just see if I can find that here, because he gets wounded, and you sort of think to yourself, well, how did he get wounded? Here we go. Okay. So in this instance here, I knew that Frank had been wounded on a particular date, and it was a date that I wasn't very familiar with. So I had the opportunity to learn about a new battle, and it's the Battle of Sniper's Ridge. And the 9th Battalion were tasked with attacking these Turkish trenches in broad daylight. So you picture the final battle of Gallipoli, the movie, and that's what these boys are about to go out into. And so when you look at his service records, all it says is wounded 28 June 1915, and that's it. And you think, well, how did he get wounded? What happened there? And then all of a sudden you come across this letter. And in the letter, Frank says, on the afternoon of June 28, our company, B Company, together with C Company, were ordered to take a trench in front of our trenches. I had volunteered to go as a bomb thrower. There were 6 of us to the company, and of course we had to lead the way out of the trenches. Country, of course, is very hilly about here, and there were 2 ridges between the 2 trenches, or at least one between, and the next trench being on the second. As soon as we put our head over the trenches, they were at us with a rapid fire, and we had not gone more than 5 paces before a shell went whizzing past us and burst to our rear, catching several of our men behind. We bomb throwers at once opened out at several pace intervals and fixed our bayonets. Another shell came and burst right in front of me and ploughed up the earth all around, but I escaped. We doubled over the ridge and down into the next hollow. We were now right below the Turkish trenches, and they were firing down the slope at us as we came up and hurling bombs in all directions. They now had guns playing on us from all quarters. Several more shells burst near me, just to the side. I could see the smoke from them out of the corner of my eye, but I did not bother to turn my head to see whether they had hit anyone. The main object was to get close enough to the trenches on top of the ridge to be able to use my bombs. I was just putting my hand into my haversack to feel for a bomb when a shell burst just a little to the right of me, and at the same minute it felt as if someone had hit me in the back with a sledgehammer. A friend of mine who was just on my left shouted, "What's up, Frank?" For I had almost fallen, but managed to stagger to my feet. I shouted, "I'm hit." I then put my hand on the back of my tunic and could find no signs of bleeding. All I could feel was the hole where it had entered. I did not know whether the shot had gone through me or not. The pain was great enough for anything. However, I managed to pull myself together and tried to catch up with my mates. But it was no use. The muscles had all gone stiff and I could hardly move. And then it just goes on from there. And I think the thing that stood out to me there was that even though he'd been hit his first thought was, I've got to get to my mates and I've got to get those bombs up to this trench. And unfortunately, his whole right side seized up because the was actually pushing on his spine and paralyzing his right hand side. So pretty
That's what I was
frightening.
going to ask you. What wounds he sustained?
Yeah, he was
Mm.
paralyzed, and he had to crawl basically 250 yards back to his own trench. He was trying to drag other wounded mates back with him as he was trying to do it one-handed.
Jesus
So,
Christ. They're a different level of
just
human back there then, weren't they? Like,
absolutely
mm,
Superman. Um,
mm.
So it was a real honor to get to know them, and I felt like I got to know them. They were my boys, and it was quite terrible for me when I finished writing the book because it was like we'd stopped talking for a bit. So you sort of,
Had they wrote about the end of the war? Talking about ending the book, did they write about the end of the war?
I think they didn't so much write about the end of the war, apart from a couple where they sort of were just eager to get home. I think that the main thing that they wanted to do was the job had been done, and they
Yeah.
just wanted to get home. A couple of them went to England to learn some new trades,
Okay.
so they could take the skills back with them to Australia. So they got like a leave of absence to go and do some work in England. Um, One of them in particular, one of the reasons I call it Duty Nobly Done is because they're all a bunch of goody two-shoes, just like me. So none of them had any red ink in their book. Until January 1919, after the war had finished, one of them went AWOL over Christmas and New Year's for about 3 or 4 days. So he got some red ink, but it was after the war, so it doesn't count.
I don't think that counts either.
Yeah, but no,
Who are they?
they were just.
Who was he writing that letter to? That was the account of him getting wounded.
That was actually to his father. So
That's
Frank,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Frank was pretty straight up with his parents. So I think they were all pretty pragmatic. Most of them, the casualty lists were ridiculous, and they were just.
Mm.
And that's one of the other things I know from some of the research is my great grandfather before he joined up. He would get letters at home or read the letters that Frank had been sending back, and I remember him writing that Frank's mother was terrified of reading the newspaper in those first couple of months on Gallipoli because she just couldn't stand the idea of seeing his name in the casualty lists. So, so it was pretty terrible stuff at home too. So, but the book sort of focuses more on their experiences, not so much what happens at home. So otherwise it'd be twice the size and it would never have got published.
You should do another one. You should do a volume 2 in regards to the homes, weave them into it through their letters and stories, but from the home front.
Yeah, that would be interesting to do.
Yeah, I mean, you could do it as fiction and then have that element of truth in it as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't think I'd be very popular if I started writing another book here.
Why?
Very time consuming, very, and I think in a way it with my as I mentioned before, very immersive. To be able to write that book, I had to sort of be in the 1914, 1918 period of it. And
did you start speaking a lot more formally?
Yeah,
in your
well,
everyday life?
Yes, absolutely. I enjoy British comedies and Blackadder and all that stuff. So and Blackadder Goes Forth is the one where they're in the First World War trenches. So I usually talk like that anyway. So, but it was just a really interesting experience. There was a few times I put it aside for about 3 months, and I almost decided that it was getting to be too much. But I eventually got it done, and in a way, it was a little bit of a therapy too for me. From being a policeman for 16 years, a lot of stuff that I'd gone through was able to sort of incorporate into this. So that was helpful in a way too. That was actually quite good. from that point of view.
What areas of policing were you in? Because you were
Uh,
in for a while.
yeah, I was just over 16 years in
Yeah.
the Queensland Police. So it was mainly general duties, uniform. So I never did traffic branch. So I did general duties, and then I went to criminal investigation branch. And then I finished at the academy training the recruits, operational skills and tactics before I left the job. So about 10 years ago now.
So
So,
how did your time in the police force, you said that it was cathartic for you. I don't know if you use those exact words, but I'll put words in your mouth to some degree. In regards to writing the book about them, given your service, why was it so cathartic?
I think because you go through so many different, I guess, traumatic experiences as a police officer, and they're largely unresolved. You go from job to job, and then you basically go home and you come back and do it again the next day. So you're very rarely going to admit you've got a concern or a problem if with anything. I remember one particular job in my first year, we had two fatal car accidents in one afternoon, and the first one was that stereotypical awful one you don't want to go to, and then the second one was a young fellow. He's only 18, and I was only 21 at the time, so I joined when I was very, very young. And I remember saying to one of the senior constables I was working with, I said, I had a pretty awful afternoon. You reckon we should, go back to the station and have a drink? And I was just going to have a soft drink. I don't drink. He just went, no, I'm just going home. And I went, oh, okay. And so that's how we deal with that. Okay, no worries. And I remember being rung by a HSO from Brisbane to see if
What's
I
an
was okay.
HSO?
Oh, human services officer, I think it was back then, or human support officer, something
HR,
along those lines,
essentially.
something like that. And they rang me from Brisbane, and they said, "How did you go? Is everything all right?" I went, "Yeah, I'm fine." And they went, "Okay, good." So you just went, "Okay, so that's fine." So you just get on with it, and so you just sort of go through the motions, and you just do the job and just keep going. And I guess from that point of view, it sort of gives you a little bit, not a lot, I'm talking like 1% compared to what these blokes went through. It just gives you that idea that the mind can accommodate a lot, but not forever, So I
How do
think,
you how do you deal with that coming home when you've had let's term it as a hard day in terms of what you've seen and what you've had to experience, and then not pass that trauma onto your partner or significant other, and also allow them to understand that you've had a really bad day?
yeah, I think for me, I was able to compartmentalize it and therefore not share it very often with people.
Mm.
So, and that wasn't the best way to deal with it. I know that, it's like, but you sort of, again, like these boys here, they're trying to shield their family from the hurt and the pain. That's one aspect of why we don't talk about it. The other is you've already dealt with it, so you don't want to rehash it. So it's not even
Have
that
you
you
dealt
don't
with
want to
it?
tell them. It's as best as you possibly can, I think, because there's so much. I mean, there's no one particular job that sort of comes to mind that I have any drama with. So that's been good.
Mm.
I don't have I don't have any dreams or things like that. So, but being out of the job has been a really awesome blessing because I've been able to get alongside a lot of current serving, emergency services, first responders, with your paramedics in particular, is a really tough job. And the one piece of advice I give them, which I didn't have given to me and I sort of worked out as I went along, was to keep those lines of communication open with your loved ones from the very beginning. And that'll help you to deal with it, but also help them to not get it all in one go when everything unravels, and they can sort of just get an insight into what you're going through, just to be a listening ear, but also it also helps you to avoid developing a God complex and resentment. Because one of the things that possibly can creep in when you're in law enforcement or paramedic is that life and death struggle, the good and evil thing, where you're out and about doing all this and saving the world. What would you know about it? So that can creep in a little bit too. And so,
do you think it's interesting you describe that as a God complex? I would just say that that's how you would. I don't know. I don't even know if I wouldn't describe it as a God complex. I don't know what I'd describe it as, but
yeah, that's the closest I can come to. It's not so much like not like power of life and death sort of stuff, but more a case of you sort of
know
are
what
like
you're
that
talking about.
That thin blue line. Like you are that line between order and chaos. You can sort of buy into that a little bit, I guess, and you sort of shielding people from the hurt and the pain, and then absorbing it all yourself. So yeah, it's an interesting concept. There's a lot of things happening all at once. So just being able to talk to people, and what I find is that the coppers who are currently serving are less likely to talk to another copper because they don't want to admit that they're having a problem. They won't talk to a normal member of public because they don't know what they're going through. But someone who's been in it is now out of it. So sometimes that's helpful. So just to take a bit of pressure off them.
I've heard that a lot. I've had a lot of, well, not a lot. I've had a few ex-coppers on, and they've said that. And I think there's quite a few charities in Victoria now that do it, and that have the retirees, talking to the current ones that needing a hand and so forth. I think it's important that the protectors also need help as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there's only so much that you can deal with, and in this day and age, you just look at the way society's going. It's a lot tougher now. It's a lot tougher than when I was in the job. So they need all the support they can get.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that is? It's a lot tougher these days. Why do you think? Oh God, this could be going down the rabbit hole, Adam. So we'll just touch on it and see where it goes. But why do you think? I don't know. Well, do you think that the society's in the shit at the moment?
Yeah, it certainly doesn't have the same feeling of stability and decency that when I grew up, like the 80s and the 90s. And I think a lot of that has to do with, the lack of respect for authority, the infinite knowledge, or in inverted commas, knowledge that people have at their fingertips. Everyone's an expert, and so they're more willing to stand up and resist authority, whether it's a teacher or it's a police officer, all those old institutions that used to have some level of authority. Yeah. So yeah. So they just sort of don't have that now. I think with that comes that group mentality too, where they, the coppers, like police cars being rocked and even burnt, and police officers being set upon and beat up more often, and you just,
Where's that happening?
In general, as a police officers, all over the world, just so.
Oh yeah. Well, if you discount America, we won't discuss America. It's a whole different
it sure is.
fish in terms of their search circumstances.
But Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, they're a bit tougher to police down there than it is up here. That's for sure.
I have theories in terms of maybe why Victoria is in recent years like that. For the rest of Australia, I don't know. I can't comment.
Fair enough. How's Tasmania? It's a much nicer place to
Tasmania's lovely.
And Brisbane's lovely too. I love Brisbane.
We nearly moved to Brizzy, but I referred to myself as a Victorian refugee the other day. So there you go.
But they let you in though,
This
so that was
part of the
lovely of
episode, this may get cut out.
them. That's fair enough. You probably cut a lot out, actually.
No. What do you think the main point that you'd like the readers of the book should take away from your boys and you writing about the boys?
I think it comes down to regardless of what people are thinking from modern times, why the war happened or how the war was conducted. It's about the individuals and those principles and values that they took with them to the war and still even came home with, like dependability, responsibility, duty, honor, sacrifice, love, just that compassion for each other that, every society needs, even now more than ever. People who are willing to look out for each other and look after each other. And these are the ideals that they thought were worth fighting for and dying for. So I just really admire their determination and their courage, and they genuinely thought they were doing the right thing. And I think that their sacrifice wasn't in vain. I think what they fought for, we can still fight for today. And I think it's as current now
it's
as it was
important
back
not to
then.
lose that. And I think it's important not to waste that sacrifice as well. I know we sort of touched on society today, but I think it's important to remember those who did fight for those freedoms and have fought for those freedoms since, and not to let it be a waste as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can fall into that trap if people go, "Oh, what a waste! All those men died for nothing," and you think, well, they thought they were fighting for the right reasons, and
well, I would imagine that World War One and World War Two, they all fought. I don't think anyone would question that, would they?
Oh yeah, every time I'll do talks from time to time, and people will trail out the old "what a waste" and it was all for nothing, and the British just used the Australians as cannon fodder. It's the same old cliches, and that's one of the other things that I hope comes out of the book is there's none of that in there. It just tells the truth of what happened to the boys. So just dispelling.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, and I can't comment. I don't know enough about it to comment on those statements, but I certainly think that going over and World War One was meant to stop the wars, and then everyone was back there again fighting Hitler, and I think that those were very valid wars.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. He's standing up to bullies, and that's what the Australians were doing. They were over there to stop like the aggression of of other nations thinking they can just waltz into someone else's country and take it. And there's so many other factors involved why Australia got involved, but one of those is that they just don't like bullies, and they
never like a bully.
No, and they still don't. So yeah.
Well, the bullies can get stuffed.
Exactly. They need a good slapping. So that's what you do. You step when they rise up. You've got to step up and knock them back down. So and that's what I think that the boys went and did. That's why they went.
Adam, do you have another letter that you can read to finish the episode?
I'll see what I can find here for you. There was an instance during the research where I couldn't find where Frank had been for a 6-month period. His official service records did not mention anything about it. None of the letters that he wrote that I came across during the war mentioned where he was between January 1916 and basically May 1916. And it wasn't until we came across the letters that he wrote to Fred Palmer Archer, where he explains basically word for word exactly what he was doing, and that this was a really pivotal moment during my research and the writing of the book. It really changed everything as to how I could write this book. And he's writing about how it all came to be, but this is the way he writes. He's writing to Fred. He says, "Forgive me, Fred, if I deviate here and there as the spirit moves me. Paul Robinson, a few years my senior, we used to shoot together in the Roma Rifle Club pre-World War I. Coming out of hospital in England after Gallipoli following leave, I went to the Australian Details Camp at Weymouth. Troops awaiting draft to Egypt before going to France were there. It was announced on parade that 25 applications were wanted for officers and senior NCOs for 5 positions as physical training instructors. As a sergeant, I decided to enter thinking it would be good training. I was safe not to be selected, as I was keen to go out to Egypt again and to see France. But to my horror, I was one of the 5 finalists who got selected as a PT instructor. Well, I had asked for it. So to make the best of things, I got on with it. Conditions at that moment were wonderful. 1.5 hours duty, 6 a.m. to 7:30, was our tour of duty for the day. Our special dress, white sweater with heavy rolled collar, black serge trousers, tan sand shoes, and a black peak cap. Special tent with special meals, and a standing leave pass which allowed us between 7:30 a.m. and 6 a.m. tomorrow morning to go where we liked, London, Bournemouth, etc., provided we were back on by 6 a.m. And this is where Fiona you start to see the character of Frank coming out in the next few lines, where he says, "It went like this for about 6 weeks or so, and my conscience began to prick me, particularly when I saw old cobbers going through on their way to do their bit again. Though we had been warned by the commanding officer, Colonel Courtney, this was to be a duration of the war job. We had done our bit on Gallipoli. However, here goes. I headed to see the lion in his den requesting to be released. No, definitely no. I said duration of the war, and duration of the war it shall be." And then what follows then is he has a fortuitous meeting with this Paul Robinson, who he knew from Roma, who's a captain in the Light Horse, and he just happens to be in Weymouth. And he pulls the strings and manages to get Frank out of this duty and back to Egypt and back into the war. And it really typified to me just the type of almost peer pressure by the way that the captain actually says to him, "That's a cold-footed job you are on, Frank." So we have Frank already feeling like, "Hey, I've got to get back. I'm feeling pretty awful." And then this fellow who's several years his senior, and he respects him as a mentor even from Roma, actually flat out says, you're behaving like a bit of a coward. You've got cold feet. And so the combination of the two, and he basically stows away on a ship to get back to Egypt he goes AWOL to get back to the war, basically. So
did he end up joining the Light Horsemen?
No, he went back and joined the 9th Battalion again. He's an original 9th Battalion soldier. But the captain from the Light Horse, Robinson, he went back and joined the Light Horse, and so he fought on Gallipoli as well, Robinson. So he had a lot of time for Frank, and but yeah, he basically was very honest and put a bit of extra pressure on Frank. But Frank was already thinking, "I've got to get back. I just don't know how." And then Robinson managed to find a way to get him back. So.
And these letters are included in your book?
Oh yeah, it allowed me to really expand on how Frank went about what he did to get back again. So yeah, it was fun. It was a fun part of the book to write, because he's basically running away from the camp after being told you can't leave.
He's lucky he didn't get court-martialed.
He's very lucky. And you can, even when he's contemplating it later, and just the whole time he's still in England, moving further and closer to the ship where he's going to get on, he's just expecting to be picked up the whole time. And he's probably the biggest goody two-shoes out of all of them. So it was awesome. It was a really fun section to write. So yeah,
Adam,
I didn't think he had it in him.
The book is incredible. If anybody listening is his history buff, war buff, ancestral information buff, it's perfect. So where can they find it? Title of the book, and where can they find it?
Okay, so it's Duty Nobly Done by Adam Holloway from Big Sky Publishing, from Booktopia, any sort of online book retailer, also Dimmicks, QBD, all sort of bookstores that you can get it from. So yeah.
And the tours are dndbattletours.com.au. They can find that. Is that the website?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. So we have pretty much a full tour for April coming up, which is just amazing. We're really pleased
What can
with the
people
support.
expect?
What they can expect is to get away from the memorials and the cemeteries, because they only tell part of the story. So we get out onto the ground and actually walk the battlefields and get a proper understanding without not like a lecture, but a genuine understanding of exactly what happened and why. And because it's a very unique style of warfare, the trench warfare from the First World War, just getting an understanding. And then I'll take a group after that down to Normandy to go and check out the World War II sites, the D-Day beaches and things like that. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So, but 2025, it's already taking bookings. So if people are interested, come along. Be a great time.
How many tours do we do a year?
At this stage, just the one in April. And then we're looking to develop more tours throughout the year, just to give people a nice variety of different locations.
dndbattletours.com.au. Everyone go and get your tours booked. Thanks,
Absolutely.
Adam.
Thanks, Fiona.
The One Moment Please podcast.
Yeah.